Not every soldier comes home to peace. For many veterans, the hardest battles begin after the war, in the silence, in the loneliness, and in the memories that never fade. But sometimes, even in the coldest winter, a single spark of warmth can change everything. This is the story of a man who had only $10 left, and a loyal dog by his side, two souls who stumbled upon a hidden hot spring deep in the mountains and found, somehow, a reason to live again. If you believe that kindness can still bloom in a frozen world, hit like and subscribe, so we can keep sharing more stories that remind us what it truly means to be human. The Blue Ridge Mountains in winter are a place where sound disappears. Even the wind, sharp as broken glass, moves in silence across the frozen ridges. Snow piles up on the pines like thick white armor, and somewhere in that endless white, a man sat in a dead truck, staring into the cold. Ethan Rowe, once a military engineer, now just another forgotten man in a forgotten place. Beside him, curled up on the torn seat, was Shadow, a 6-year-old German shepherd with gray dusting his muzzle and eyes that carried more loyalty than most people Ethan had ever known. The truck's engine had coughed its last breath hours ago. The fuel gauge was buried in the red. Outside, the road had vanished under snow. No lights, no movement, no hope of anyone passing by until morning, maybe not even then. Ethan rubbed his hands together, watching his breath cloud up like ghosts. He reached into his jacket pocket, pulled out his wallet, and stared at what little was left. $17 and some coins, enough for one more meal, maybe two, if he stretched it. He laughed, a sound dry and bitter. $17 and a loyal dog, he muttered. That's all the empire I've got left. Shadow lifted his head, ears twitching, as if to remind Ethan that even a broken kingdom can still have a faithful knight. Ethan reached over, scratching behind his ears. Yeah, I know, buddy. You didn't sign up for this either. He leaned back against the seat, closing his eyes. The truck creaked with the weight of snow piling on the roof. The heater was long dead. The cold slipped in through the cracks like a thief. It had been 3 years since his divorce, 2 since he'd lost his job at the defense plant, and nearly 1 year since he last heard from his son, who'd stopped answering calls, maybe out of anger, or maybe just exhaustion. Ethan couldn't blame him. He'd promised stability. He'd delivered chaos. Outside, the night deepened. Snow fell heavier, smothering the world. Inside the truck, Ethan whispered, almost to himself, maybe this is where it ends. Old friend. Shadow lifted his head again, sensing something in Ethan's voice, that slow, quiet surrender. He whimpered once, a soft plea in the dark. Ethan smiled weakly. Hey, it's okay. You've done your part. We've made it farther than most. He pulled his army jacket tighter and closed his eyes, letting exhaustion take him. The world faded to a dull hum until Shadow's sudden bark shattered the silence. Shadow, what is it? The dog was at the window, pawing at the glass, ears high. He barked again, low and insistent. Ethan frowned, grabbed his flashlight, and opened the door. A blast of cold air hit him like a slap. Snow whirled in, biting his face. Easy, easy, he said, stepping into the storm. What's got you worked up? Shadow jumped into the snow, nose down, tail stiff, tracking something. Ethan followed, the beam of his flashlight cutting through the white. The dog moved fast, weaving through trees and rocks, until suddenly Ethan saw it too, a faint, silvery steam rising from the ground. At first he thought it was just fog, but then there it was, a small opening in the rock, breathing out warm vapor into the frozen air. What the hell? Ethan cried, reaching his hand toward it. The warmth was real soft, almost human in the way it wrapped around his skin. He brushed the snow aside and found a narrow crack leading into a hollow. Inside, water trickled, steaming gently like a secret kept for centuries. Shadow wind, pawing at the edge, tail wagging now instead of stiff with alert. It's a hot spring, Ethan said, disbelief turning into laughter. A damn hot spring. In the middle of nowhere. He dipped his hand in. The warmth stuck at first, then melted the ache from his fingers. For the first time in months, he felt something alive, not just the water, but himself. He sat there for a long while, just watching the steam rise, listening to the faint sound of water echoing inside the rock. The contrast was almost cruel. Warmth and death, side by side in the wilderness. Ethan took a deep breath and whispered, "Guess not everything's frozen yet." Shadow pressed against his leg, eyes bright in the beam of the flashlight. "Yeah," Ethan said softly, looking at him. "Maybe there's still something left worth fighting for." He stayed there until the cold began to lose its edge, until he could almost believe the world hadn't completely abandoned him. When he finally stood up, the night didn't seem quite as dark anymore. The wind still howled, but now it sounded less like despair, and more like a song, something ancient, something alive. Ethan looked down at the spring one last time, steam curling upward like a fragile dream. He smiled, faint but real. "Come on, Shadow," he said, voice steady now. "Let's see what tomorrow looks like." And together, man and dog, they turned back toward the old truck, leaving footprints in the snow that the storm, mercifully, did not yet cover. The sun rose late that morning, or maybe it only felt that way. Out in the Blue Ridge, dawn came not with warmth, but with a pale silver light that struggled to break through the clouds. The storm had passed, leaving behind a world buried in silence. Ethan Rowe woke to the sound of his own breath, white in the cold air. The truck was still dead. His body ached from the night, but Shadow was there, tail thumping weakly against the seat, eyes bright and waiting. Ethan smiled faintly. "Yeah, morning to you too." He pushed open the door. Snow crunched under his boots. The mountain air was sharp enough to sting, but it carried something else, to a faint scent of pine. And maybe, just maybe, a hint of hope. The memory of the hot spring flickered in his mind, that little pocket of warmth beneath the ice. It hadn't saved him, but it had reminded him he still wanted to be saved. He glanced down the road, a ribbon of white winding toward the valley. Somewhere out there had to be a town, a place with people, food, maybe even work. "Come on, Shadow," he said. "Let's see what the world's got left for us." They walked for hours, boots sinking deep, breath rising like steam. By the time the road curved toward a cluster of rooftops, Ethan's legs were trembling from exhaustion, but when he saw the old wooden sign, "Welcome to Redleaf," he almost laughed. The town was small, half frozen in time. A diner with fogged-up windows, a hardware store with faded lettering, and a notice board near the post office, its surface warped and peeling from years of rain. Ethan stopped there, brushing snow from the edges. Most of the papers were old missing dog posters, a church bake sale, a room for rent that probably didn't exist anymore. And then, one piece of paper caught his eye, a yellowed flyer, corners torn, words scrolled in fading black ink. "OLD cabin for SALE, $10 buyer responsible for repairs." He blinked. $10? That couldn't be right. Behind him, an old man was locking up the general store. He noticed Ethan staring. "You looking at that old thing?" he asked, his voice rough with age and smoke. Ethan nodded. "Yeah, $10. That a joke?" The man chuckled, shaking his head. "Not a joke. Lace been sitting empty for 20 years. Folks say it's cursed. Roof's half gone, floors rotten. Ain't worth the nails holding it together." Ethan's brow furrowed. "So why hasn't anyone torn it down?" The old man shrugged. "Too far out, middle of Stone Hollow. 6 miles through bad roads and worse memories. Ain't much out there but trees, snow, and ghosts." He spat into the snow and smiled. "You really want that place, Mr. Hell, the ghosts will be glad for company." Ethan didn't laugh. He just stared at the paper, the number printed at the bottom, $10 glowing faintly under a smear of frost. $10 less than a tank of gas, less than what he'd wasted on things that never mattered. He thought of the hot spring again, that strange warmth beneath the snow. A sign, maybe, or just luck. Either way, something in his chest stirred the same stubborn spark that had made him survive this long. He looked down at Shadow, who sat quietly at his feet, ears pricked as if waiting for an answer. Ethan exhaled, slow and steady. $10, that's 2 meals. Buddy, he paused, then added, softer, "but if it's a roof, if it's ours, maybe that's worth more." The man behind him snorted. "You serious? You'd really buy that dump?" Ethan smiled faintly. "Depends. Who do I pay?" An hour later, a thin woman at the post office handed him a single rusted key in an envelope with faded directions. She looked at him the way people look at someone who's already lost. "Stone Hollow's not what it used to be," she warned. "You be careful out there." "I've been careful my whole life," Ethan said, tucking the key into his pocket. "Didn't get me very far." Shadow wagged his tail as if in agreement. They left town before dusk, following a narrow trail that wound through the woods. The air grew colder with every step, but the snow had stopped falling. Rays of dying sunlight filtered through the trees, painting the world in golden blue. By the time they reached the outskirts of Stone Hollow, the sky had turned purple. The cabin stood on a small rise barely visible through the birch trees. It looked exactly like the townsfolk had warned. Half-collapsed roof, windows shattered, the front steps swallowed by snow. But behind the decay, there was shape, structure, potential. Ethan stood there for a long time, staring at it. Most people would have turned away, but he saw something else, a challenge, a second chance disguised as ruin. He pushed the door open. The hinges screamed, echoing through the hollow rooms. Dust hung in the air like ghosts. Shadow sniffed around, tail wagging cautiously. The floor creaked under Ethan's boots. A broken chair, an old stone fireplace, and on the far wall a mirror cracked down the middle, reflecting two figures, one man, one dog, both looking like they'd already seen the end and were still standing. Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Well, Shadow," he said, voice echoing softly. "Guess this is home now." The dog barked once, as if to say yes. Ethan stepped toward the window. Outside, the snow shimmered under the moonlight, silver, endless, and strangely peaceful. He could almost feel the spring's warmth again beneath the ground somewhere nearby, as if the mountain itself was breathing. He closed his eyes and whispered, "Light beneath the snow. That's all we need." And for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was running from something. He felt like he was walking toward it. The morning after Ethan found the cabin listing, he walked back into Redleaf to make it official. The town was half asleep under a thin veil of frost. Smoke curled from the diner chimney, the smell of burnt coffee lingering in the air. Inside the small county office, the heat was barely working. A space heater buzzed near the counter, and papers were piled in uneven stacks across every surface. Behind the desk sat Ruth Coleman, a woman well into her 70s, gray hair pulled tight into a bun. She looked up over her glasses when Ethan stepped in. "Well," she said, squinting. "You the one asking about the cabin out in Stone Hollow?" Ethan nodded. "That's me," Ruth chuckled, shaking her head. "You sure about that? No electricity, no running water. Roof leaks like a sieve. Place is half part mountain, half bad decision." Ethan smiled faintly. "Ma'am, I've lived in worse places than bad decisions." That earned him a smirk. "Fair enough." A younger woman appeared from the back. Anna Marin, the town clerk. She couldn't have been older than 30, with auburn hair tied back under a wool cap. She carried a small envelope, yellowed around the edges. "This came with the property records," she said, handing it to Ethan. "Belonged to the previous owner. We thought you might want it." Ethan frowned, opening the flap carefully. Inside was a single slip of paper, brittle and faded, written in simple cursive, "Keep this place kind. Silas Drew." He read the words twice, then looked up. "Who was he?" Anna leaned against the counter. "Silas Drew. Lived there for nearly 40 years. Folks said he was strange but good. He'd taken travelers, sometimes drifters, vets, people who had nowhere to go. They said he kept the fire burning all winter for anyone who needed warmth." Ruth nodded slowly. "He passed about 10 years ago. No kin left, no will. County took the land. Nobody wanted it since." Ethan folded the note and slipped it into his jacket pocket. "Guess it's mine now." Ruth chuckled again, sliding a single, rusted key across the counter. $10 cash only, and don't come running back here when the walls start talking." Ethan laid down a worn $10 bill, the last of what he had. For a moment, he stared at it lying there, thin and fragile, like the bridge between his past and whatever came next. Anna looked at him curiously. "You're really going to live out there?" He smiled faintly. "If the roof holds." The road to Stone Hollow was little more than a memory of pavement, swallowed by roots and snow. Ethan's truck groaned under the climb, tires slipping on frozen mud. Shadow sat upright in the passenger seat, watching the trees blur past birch, pine, and oak, their branches heavy with ice. By the time they reached the ridge, the light had already begun to fade. Ethan parked near the edge of the trail and stepped out, boots crunching against the frost. The world around him was quiet to quiet. No sound but the wind through the trees and the soft trickle of unseen water beneath the earth. He followed the narrow path until it opened into a small hollow, ringed by rock and shadow, and there it was, the cabin, half wood, half stone, like it had been carved out of the mountain itself. The roof slanted unevenly, patched with old hinge sheets. The door hung crooked on one hinge, but somehow it was still standing. Ethan stopped a few yards away, just staring. The whole thing looked like it might crumble if he breathed too hard. Then he noticed it, a faint wisp of steam rising from the ground near the steps. The same kind of warmth he'd felt at the spring. He crouched down, brushing away a layer of snow. Beneath, the soil was damp and hot to the touch. "Would you look at that?" he murmured. "The earth's still breathing." Shadow sniffed at the steam, tail wagging, and let out a low bark that echoed through the hollow. Ethan stood, rubbing his hands together. "Yeah, buddy, I think we found something special." He pushed open the door. It groaned like an old man waking from a long sleep. Inside, dust floated in the air like tiny ghosts. The smell of old wood and stone filled his lungs, cold, but not dead. A single table stood near the corner, legs uneven. The fireplace was black with soot, but still solid. A few old jars lined the shelves, their labels long faded. Ethan ran his hand along the mantel. brushing off a layer of ash. He could almost see Silas Drew sitting there, an old man with a long coat, tending the fire while strangers warmed their hands nearby. He turned to Shadow. "We're standing in someone else's kindness, but guess it's our job to keep it that way." The dog wagged his tail in approval. Ethan knelt by the hearth, stacking a few dry sticks from the corner. It took several tries, but eventually the flame caught, small at first, then steady. Warm light filled the cabin, bouncing off the cracked walls, chasing away the years of cold. He sat there for a long time, watching the fire dance. The flicker of orange on the stone walls reminded him of something he'd forgotten, what it felt like to belong somewhere, even if just for a night. Outside, the wind howled against the mountain, but inside, the air began to hum, that soft, alive warmth that comes not from heat, but from presence. Ethan leaned back, whispering, "Shadow, I think we just bought ourselves a miracle. $10 for a piece of peace." Shadow lay down beside him, head on his boots, eyes closing slowly. The fire crackled, and for the first time in years, Ethan didn't feel like he was drifting through life. He was home. That night, as the storm rolled back across the ridge, Ethan dreamed of water glowing beneath the ground like a hidden heart. And somewhere deep inside that dream he heard a voice, faint but clear, whispering the same words from the note, "Keep this place kind." When he woke, the fire had burned low, and dawn was painting the snow outside in soft gold. He looked around the small cabin, broken, old, imperfect, and smiled. "Kind," he said quietly. "Yeah, I can do that." Morning came slow and pale over Stone Hollow. The mountains were still draped in snow, but something had shifted. The air felt alive, like the earth itself was breathing through the cracks of the old cabin. Ethan Rowe woke to silence, the kind that wasn't empty, just still. The fire in the hearth had burned down to a soft red glow. Shadow stirred beside him, tail tapping against the floorboards. "All right, buddy," Ethan murmured, stretching his arms. "Let's make this place a home." He stepped outside, breath turning white against the air. The world glittered, ice crystals hanging from every branch. For a moment, the whole mountain seemed to shimmer under the early light, like it was made of glass. He gathered what he could: fallen branches, bits of dry bark, and the remnants of an old crate he found by the shed. When he lit the first flame of the morning, the warmth spread slow but sure, filling the small cabin with that steady orange chum. It was the first real fire Ethan had made for himself in years, not for warmth, not for cooking, but for living. He spent the day working, cleaning, lifting, repairing. The floor was damp, the air heavy with mildew, but he didn't care. He cleared out broken glass. He shoveled away the snow that had crept in through the doorway, and patched the holes in the roof with sheets of old tin. Every swing of the hammer, every breath of sawdust felt like a small declaration. "I'm still here." At noon, he stood back to look at his work, sweat on his forehead despite the cold. The place was still rough, still half broken, but it was no longer dying. Shadow trotted around, nose in everything, tail wagging proudly as if he'd built it himself. Ethan laughed softly. Not bad for day one. The air inside was getting warmer now, not just from the fire but from something deeper. A thin mist was rising from the floorboards near the wall. He crouched down, curious, and pressed his hand to the wood. It was warm, too warm. He frowned, then pried up one of the loose planks with his crowbar. Steam drifted up through the gap, faint, steady, almost alive. "Shadow," he whispered, "I think there's something down there." He widened the opening and shone his flashlight through. Below the cabin floor was a hollow space, maybe 3 feet deep, and beyond that, an opening in the rock, a cave. The air rising from it shimmered with heat. Ethan grabbed a lantern and climbed down carefully, boots scraping against the stone. The air grew warmer with each step, the walls glowing faintly with moisture. The sound came next, the quiet rush of water echoing in the dark, and then he saw it, a stream, no wider than a river of light, running through the rock. The water shimmered in soft golden blue, illuminated by minerals glowing faintly beneath the surface. Steam drifted upward, curling through the air like smoke from an unseen heart. Ethan just stood there, speechless. It wasn't just beautiful, it felt sacred. "Looks like the mountain's got a pulse," he murmured. He dipped his hand into the stream. The water was warm, not hot, not cold, but alive. Shadow barked once from above, echoing off the stone. Ethan looked up, smiling. "You were right to dig, buddy. We found the heart of it." He lingered there for a while, listening to the sound of the water, steady, timeless, like a whisper from beneath the world. And in that sound, something in him eased. All the noise that had haunted him, the regrets, the silence of lost years, fell quiet when he finally climbed back up. The cabin felt different, warmer, brighter, like the earth itself had decided to keep him alive. As night fell, the snow outside turned silver under the moonlight. Ethan sat by the fire, the lantern glowing beside him, notebook open on his knee. He wrote slowly, not a letter, not a plan, just words that felt like a beginning. He tore a piece of paper from the pad, wrote a single line, and pinned it to the cabin wall above the mantel. Day 1. Not lost. Just resting. He leaned back, reading it again in the firelight. It wasn't poetry, but it was true. Shadow lay curled by the hearth, breathing slow and steady. Ethan reached down to scratch behind his ears. You know, he said softly, maybe this is how it starts. Not with a big plan, just staying, just trying. The dog thumped his tail once, a quiet rhythm against the floor. Outside, the wind sighed through the pines, the snow whispered over the roof, and beneath it all, deep under the stone, the warm current kept flowing. Unseen, but constant. Ethan watched the flame flicker and thought about the man who'd written that note Silas drew. Keep this place kind, it said. Maybe that was the secret. Maybe kindness wasn't something you gave. Maybe it was something you built, one small act at a time. He looked around the cabin, cracked walls, leaking roof, rough edges, and smiled. For the first time in years, he wasn't chasing something better. He was making something enough. The fire popped softly, sending a spark up the chimney. Ethan closed his eyes, whispering to himself, not lost, just resting. And in the quiet heart of winter, that felt like a prayer. The days passed in slow rhythm, firewood, repairs, silence. The wind no longer howled like a stranger, it whispered like something that belonged. One morning, while fixing a broken shelf, Ethan found an old army jacket at the bottom of his duffel bag. Inside the pocket, wrapped in tissue, were 5 dried beans, the kind he used to keep for field rations. He turned them in his palm, rough and weightless. He stared out at the patch of thorned ground near the hot spring. Steam curled from the earth like the breath of something sleeping. Guess it's just you and me, old friend, he said to Shadow. Let's see if anything still remembers how to grow. He took a rusted shovel, cleared a small square of soil, and pushed the beans into the warm dirt. His hands trembled not from cold, but from the strange hope blooming inside him. It was January. Everything was frozen, colorless, still, and yet here he was, planting life into winter. The next day, the sound of an engine echoed faintly up the mountain road. A small pickup truck appeared, green paint chipped, tires half bald. Out stepped Anna Marin, wrapped in a red scarf and holding a box of canned goods. Ethan Rowe, she called, half smiling. You're supposed to buy groceries, not bury them. Ethan chuckled. I guess I'm testing the laws of nature. Anna looked over his small patch of soil and shook her head. You're planting beans. In January, in Stone Hollow. He shrugged, wiping his hands on his jacket. I just want to see if something can still come back from the cold. Maybe it's not about the beans, maybe it's about me. For a moment, neither spoke. Only the sound of the stream filled the silence. The steam drifted between them like slow-moving ghosts. Anna placed the box down beside the cabin door. You'll need more than optimism to survive up here, she said softly. You'll freeze before those beans sprout. Ethan smiled faintly. Maybe, but at least I'll have tried. Over the following weeks, Anna began visiting every few days, always with something new. A loaf of bread, a bag of nails, a second-hand lamp. She brought conversation, laughter, warmth. One afternoon she asked, "Why here, Ethan? You could have gone anywhere." He stared into the fire. I think I wanted a place that didn't ask questions, somewhere quiet enough to hear myself think again. Anna nodded. You found it? Stone Hollow doesn't talk much, he grinned. Then we're a perfect match. Word spread through Redleaf like snowmelt. The townsfolk started whispering about the man in the mountain, the veteran who bought a haunted cabin for $10 and planted beans in the snow. Some called him crazy, others called him brave. A few, quietly, called him inspiring. By mid-February, Ethan's hands had grown rough and steady. He had patched most of the roof, built a shelf from scrap wood, and carved a small sign that read, Stone Hollow Home 2025. He nailed it to the door. The moment felt like claiming something lost a long time ago. That evening, he walked to the small patch of soil. To his surprise, beneath the thin crust of frost, a single green sprout had pushed through, tiny, fragile, alive. He dropped to his knees, brushing away the snow. Look at that, Shadow. You see it? The dog wagged his tail and nudged Ethan's hand with his nose. Ethan smiled, voice trembling with disbelief. It's growing, it's actually growing. He stood there for a long time, watching the small leaf tremble in the cold air. It wasn't much, just one stubborn bit of life, but two, Ethan. It felt like the mountain itself had whispered back, You're not done yet. That night, Anna stopped by again. She found him sitting outside the cabin, staring at the patch of green. "You were right," he said without turning. "It's sprouting." Anna smiled softly. "Guess the world still has a little kindness left in it." He looked up at her. "Maybe it always did. We just forget where to look." The sky above Stone Hollow shimmered with faint stars. Steam rose from the spring, curling like smoke from the earth's hidden heart. Ethan leaned back, feeling the heat from the ground mixed with the chill of the air. For the first time in years, he didn't feel broken, just alive. He whispered, mostly to himself, "If a bean can grow here, maybe I can too." And somewhere in the darkness, Shadow barked once as if to say, "Yes, you already are." Winter began to loosen its grip on Stone Hollow. The snow still clung to the trees, but the days were growing longer and the sound of running water carried farther down the valley. Ethan often sat by the hot spring now, watching the steam twist into shapes above the rocks. It had become a kind of ritual, a morning conversation with the earth itself. He didn't speak out loud, but somehow, he felt like the mountain listened. One afternoon, while tending to the fire pit outside, he noticed a figure walking slowly up the dirt path, a woman, bundled in a heavy coat, gray hair tucked beneath a knitted hat. Her boots crunched through the snow. Shadow barked once, then wagged his tail. Sensing no danger, "Afternoon, ma'am," Ethan greeted, brushing off his hands. "You lost." The woman smiled kindly. "Not lost, son, just following an old memory." She introduced herself as Linda Cooper, a retired school teacher from Redleaf. She'd heard the rumors about the man in the mountains, the dog, and the miracle spring that stayed warm through the coldest nights. Ethan poured her a mug of hot tea and they sat together near the stream, where the air shimmered faintly from the heat. Linda looked around in awe. "I haven't been here in over 40 years, she said softly. "Did you know this spring has a name?" Ethan shook his head. "They used to call it Heart Water," she continued. "The native people believed this place held the breath of the earth. They said anyone who came here carrying sorrow could wash in it and be forgiven." Ethan stared at the rippling water, steam coiling like breath from a giant's lungs. "Forgiven," he echoed. "That's a word I haven't used in a long time." Linda smiled faintly. "Most of us don't, until we need it." That night, Ethan couldn't sleep. He kept hearing her words, the water of the heart. He thought of the people he'd failed. His son, his wife, the soldiers he couldn't save. The guilt he'd carried like an anchor all these years began to stir, like ice cracking on a frozen lake. Before dawn, he walked barefoot to the spring. Steam rose around him, blurring the edges of everything. He stepped in. The warmth enveloped him instantly, almost painfully at first, then gently. It was as if the mountain had arms. "If this place really forgives," he whispered, "then maybe it can forgive me, too." For the first time in years, he let himself cry, not out of weakness but release. Shadow lay quietly nearby, head resting on his paws, watching his owner with calm understanding. From that morning on, something changed in Ethan. He began working with a strange, steady energy, cutting wood, shaping planks, hauling stones from the creek. By the end of the week, the first wooden shelter stood near the spring, simple, open, and built from reclaimed lumber. Inside it, he dug a shallow pit and lined it with rocks, channeling warm water from the spring through a makeshift bamboo pipe. It wasn't perfect, but it worked, a natural hot bath, steaming in the heart of winter. When Anna came by a few days later, she stopped in disbelief. "You built this?" Ethan grinned. "Shadow helped." "What is it for?" He pointed to a small wooden sign nailed above the entrance, hand-carved with uneven letters. "Free rest, warm water." Anna ran her fingers over the words. "You're serious?" "I figure if this place could save me," Ethan said, "maybe it can save someone else, too." It didn't take long for travelers to find their way to Stone Hollow. A drifter looking for work stopped by first then. Shivering, carrying nothing but a backpack, Ethan handed him a towel and pointed toward the spring. The man stayed for a few hours, soaking in silence. When he left, he said only 2 words, "Thank you." Then came a couple passing through town, their car broken down on the highway. Then a man from Redleaf who'd recently lost his wife. They all came and went quietly, leaving behind bits of conversation, small tokens, a coin, a note, a candle. The spring began to take on a rhythm of its own, a place for broken things to breathe again. One evening, Ethan found Linda sitting near the edge of the spring, feet bare in the water. "You were right," he told her. "This place really does heal." Linda nodded, eyes distant. "It's not the water, Ethan. It's what the water reminds us of, that the heart, no matter how scarred, still knows how to be warm." He smiled softly. "Heart water makes sense now." She looked up at him. "You've given it a new name and a new purpose." Later that night, Ethan added another line beneath the sign. "For anyone who forgot what hope feels like." He stood back, watching the letters catch the glow of the firelight. The sound of the stream filled the quiet cell. Steady, alive, Shadow lay beside him, eyes half closed. The stars above shimmered through thin clouds of steam. Ethan whispered, almost to himself, "This place doesn't belong to me anymore. It belongs to everyone who needs to start over." And in the stillness of Stone Hollow, the springs seemed to murmur in reply, a deep, steady pulse beneath the ground, the voice of something ancient and kind, whispering through the water, "You're forgiven." The morning mist hung low over Stone Hollow. The air smelled faintly of pine and smoke. Ethan sat by the fire outside the cabin, warming his hands around a tin mug of coffee, while Shadow dozed near his boots. The sound of footsteps broke the quiet, slow, uneven, careful. From the trail emerged a man in his late 50s, wearing a heavy coat and carrying a worn rucksack. His face was wind-burned, eyes tired, but alive. "Morning," Ethan called out gently. The stranger nodded, breathing heavily from the climb. "Morning." He stood for a long moment, just looking at the cabin, the rising steam from the spring, and the dog, watching him curiously. Then he said softly, "Is this the place with the warm water?" Ethan smiled. "You've found it." The man introduced himself as Raymond Hale, a former Army medic. He'd lost his wife during the pandemic 2 years earlier, and since then, he'd been drifting from town to town, never staying long enough to unpack his grief. Ethan listened quietly, nodding. There was something familiar in Raymond's voice, that hollow tone carried by people who had seen too much and slept too little. "Come on," Ethan said finally. "You look like you could use a soak." He led Raymond toward the spring. The steam curled around them like a living thing. Raymond knelt at the edge, dipping his hands into the water. The heat surprised him, not just the warmth, but the gentleness of it. He let it run through his fingers, then over his wrists. His lips trembled. Without warning, he began to cry. At first it was quiet, just a shaking breath. Then the sound deepened, roar, unrestrained. He covered his face with both hands as the steam rose around him, hiding him from the world. "I'm sorry," he said between sobs. "I don't even know why I came here. I just kept walking." Ethan placed a hand on his shoulder. "You came because you needed to remember what it feels like to be alive." Raymond nodded, unable to speak. After a while they sat together in silence, listening to the water moving through the stones like a heartbeat under the earth. As the day passed, Raymond began to talk more. He spoke about the soldiers he'd patched up in tents under mortar fire, the long nights when he wished he could save just one more. He talked about his wife, how she used to hum while cooking breakfast, how the house went quiet after she was gone. Ethan didn't interrupt. He just listened, like the spring itself, patient, still, absorbing what needed to be said. Later, when the sun began to dip behind the trees, Ethan invited Raymond to stay the night. "There's a spare cot in the cabin," he said, though calling it spare might be generous. Raymond chuckled softly. "Better than the back seat of my truck." That evening, they cooked together beans and potatoes over the fire, the kind of meal that tastes better because its shared. Shadows sat nearby, watching them expectantly for scraps as they ate. Ethan glanced across the table and said, You could help me fix that roof tomorrow. It leaks." Like a confession. Raymond smiled for the first time. "I used to be good with my hands. Guess I could give it a shot." They worked side by side the next morning, prying out rotten boards, hammering down new ones. The sound of their tools echoed through the hollow, the kind of sound that brings life back to forgotten places. By noon, they had patched half the roof. Raymond wiped the sweat from his forehead and looked out at the valley below. Steam drifted lazily from the spring. He said, "I haven't heard myself laugh in over a year." Ethan grinned. "It happens to most people who come here." Raymond looked at him, a question in his eyes. "How'd you find this place?" Ethan took a breath. "Didn't. It found me." That night, as the fire crackled, Raymond pulled out a small photograph from his jacket pocket, a faded picture of a woman smiling in the sunlight. He placed it gently on the table. "Her name was Elise," he said. "She used to say that healing doesn't mean going back to who you were. It means learning how to live with who you are now." Ethan looked at the photo for a long moment. "She sounds wise." Raymond nodded. "She was." They sat quietly up to that, the spring murmuring just outside, the kind of silence that doesn't need to be filled. For the first time since his wife's death, Raymond slept through the night. In the morning, Ethan woke to the sound of laughter. Real laughter, low, raspy, alive. He stepped outside and saw Raymond tossing a stick across the yard while Shadow bounded after it, tail wagging furiously. Steam from the spring rose behind them, catching the sunlight. Ethan stood there, smiling. Something about the scene, the dog, the man, the sound made him realize that Stone Hollow had just taken its first breath of joy. When Raymond saw him, he called out, Coffee's on. Hope you don't mind. I found your beans. Ethan chuckled. You fixed my roof. You can raid my kitchen. That evening, when the sky burned gold over the ridge, Ethan added a new line to the wooden sign by the spring. Free rest, warm water, kind company. Raymond watched him carve the letters, nodding with quiet approval. You know, he said, people might start showing up. Ethan smiled. Then I guess we'll need a bigger table. And just like that, in a place once forgotten by the world, two broken men and a loyal dog began something small, something warm enough to be called hope. For the first time in years, Stone Hollow echoed with laughter. By early spring, word of Stone Hollow had spread beyond the mountains. Stories traveled faster than wind about a place where the water never froze, where weary travelers found warmth, and where broken people found rest. Ethan never advertised it. He never needed to. One soul simply told another, and somehow, the message carried itself across counties, across state lines, until it reached places where men like Gavin Burke listened. Gavin was 32, slick as the glass tower he worked in. He had the sharp smile of someone who'd never known cold mornings or empty pockets. He came driving up the mountain in a black SUV that looked wildly out of place on the dirt trail. Ethan heard the tires long before he saw the man. Shadow's ears perked, his body tense. When Gavin stepped out, he blinked at the fog rising from the spring and gave a low whistle. Well, I'll be damned, he said. It's real. Ethan set down his hammer, wiping his hands on a rag. Depends on what you mean by real. The hot spring, Gavin replied. Grinning, I thought people were exaggerating, but this could be something. Ethan tilted his head slightly. It already is. Gavin chuckled, unbothered. I'm not here to argue. I'm here to make an offer. They sat at the rough wooden table outside the cabin. Gavin opened a folder, thick papers, official seals, and numbers neatly typed in black ink. $80,000, he said, for the land and everything on it. Ethan didn't speak. Gavin leaned forward, sensing hesitation. I'm building a new retreat brand, upscale wellness resorts, eco-luxury, all that. This spring could be the centerpiece. I'm talking spas, saunas, cabins, private memberships. You'd be famous. We could even name it after you. Ethan stared past him, watching steam curl over the rocks, soft and white against the blue morning. You think people need another spa, he said quietly. I think they need a place that doesn't ask for anything. Gavin smiled, confident. Everything has a price. Mr. Rowe, that's just how the world works. Ethan looked him in the eye. Not everything. That night, the hollow was silent. Raymond had gone to town for supplies. Only Ethan and Shadow remained, sitting beside the fire outside the cabin. The stars were faint behind the drifting mist. The spring whispered softly nearby. Ethan took out his weathered journal, the same one he'd carried through every base, every storm, every loss. He wrote slowly, his handwriting uneven in the flickering light. There are things worth more than money, but only those who've lost everything can understand what they are. He closed the book, exhaled, and stared into the flames. The firelight danced across Shadow's fur. The dog raised his head, eyes reflecting orange and gold. As long as there's fire and you by my side, Ethan murmured, we stay. Shadow wagged his tail once, then laid his head back down. At dawn, Gavin returned. The SUV crunched over the frost-hardened ground. This time, he wasn't smiling. You've had time to think, he said briskly. I've got the paperwork ready. All we need is your signature. Ethan poured 2 cups of coffee and handed one to him. Why didn't come here to argue, Gavin added. But you're sitting on a gold mine, friend, and if you don't sell, someone else will find a way to make use of it. Ethan took a long sip of his coffee, then looked up. Tell me something, Gavin. When's the last time you built something that didn't make you money? The younger man blinked, caught off guard. That's not really how I measure things. Maybe that's the problem. Ethan reached for the folder Gavin had placed on the table. He opened it, leafing through the page's maps, deeds, valuations. Then he picked up the folder and, without a word, tossed it into the fire pit. The papers curled instantly, flames licking up their edges. Gavin jumped to his feet. What the hell are you doing? Ethan didn't look away from the fire. You said everything has a price. I'm saying this doesn't. Gavin's voice rose. You're insane. This place could make you rich. Ethan turned to face him.com/steady. I've been rich, he said. Didn't make me whole. The younger man stared at him angry, but beneath it, a little afraid. The kind of fear that comes when someone realizes there's a kind of strength they can't bio-control. Gavin shook his head, muttered something under his breath, and stormed toward the SUV. As he slammed the door, Ethan called out, his voice carrying over the valley, you can't own what was meant to be shared. The SUV roared down the trail, disappearing into the trees. That evening, Raymond returned to find Ethan sitting by the fire again, quiet but peaceful. "Friend of yours?" Raymond asked, glancing at the ashes in the pit. Ethan chuckled softly. "Something like that. He offered money, enough to buy 10 new lives." Raymond grinned. "And you said no?" Ethan nodded, "Said we stay." Raymond sat down beside him, rubbing his hands over the fire. "Then here's to staying," he said. They sat together in silence as the night deepened. The air shimmered faintly with the warmth of the spring, and the sound of water filled the spaces between their words. Shadow shifted closer to Ethan. Resting his head on his leg, Ethan stared into the fire, whispering almost to himself, "Money builds walls. Warmth builds homes." The flames flickered, reflecting in his eyes, steady, defiant, alive. And so Stone Hollow remained untouched, unbroken, a quiet sanctuary guarded by a man, his dog, and the steady pulse of the earth beneath them, a place that refused to be priced. Winter was dying slowly, like a candle burning down to its last inch. The air was still cold, but softer now. The snow no longer bit its side, melting into the earth in quiet surrender. Ethan Rowe woke before sunrise. When he stepped outside, the mountains breathed a pale mist that curled around the trees. The ground, once buried in white, now showed patches of dark soil, raw and alive again. In a small patch behind the cabin, something green pushed through the frost. Ethan crouched, brushing the earth with his rough fingers. Tiny bean sprouts, fragile, trembling, but stubbornly alive, had broken through the snow. He smiled, just slightly. "Guess you made it," he whispered. Shadow barked once, tail thumping against the dirt. It had been nearly a year since Ethan first found the hollow. Back then, it was nothing but stone, ash, and silence. Now, it had roots both in the ground and in the hearts of those who found their way there. By mid-March, the place began to change again. Raymond returned with 2 men from town, one a mechanic laid off after the factory closed, the other a truck driver who'd been sleeping in his rig for months. They came looking for shelter, not promises. Ethan gave them both hammers. "If you build it yourself," he said, "you'll take better care of it." Together, they raised 3 small cabins near the slope, rough but warm walls of pine, roofs sealed with tar, the scent of fresh wood mixing with the steam of the spring. Nights were filled with the sound of work songs, laughter, and the soft crackle of fire. They ate together around the same table, told stories of the lives they'd left behind, and somehow, those stories didn't sound as heavy under the open stars. A week later, Anna drove up from town. The back of her truck was loaded with food, blankets, and a single wooden sign wrapped in canvas. When she pulled it free, the letters glowed faintly under the sun. "The Hollow of Warmth, a place to heal." She smiled shyly. It felt wrong not to give it a name. Ethan ran his hand across the smooth surface of the wood. He looked up, eyes soft. "It feels right to me." They mounted it beside the path leading down to the spring where the mist rose gently, like breath from the mountain's lungs. That night, the men gathered around the fire as Anna poured coffee into tin cups. Raymond told an old joke that made everyone laugh. Shadow barked in agreement. Ethan sat quietly, listening. He hadn't heard that much laughter here, maybe ever. For the first time, Stone Hollow didn't just belong to him. It belonged to everyone who needed it. Later that night, when the others had gone to sleep, Ethan wandered to the edge of the stream. The moon hung low, silver and wide, turning the surface of the water into liquid glass. Steam rose from the spring in ribbons, swirling through the moonlight like something alive. Ethan crouched down, touched the surface. Warm, steady, unchanged. He could almost hear the earth's pulse beneath it, quiet, patient, eternal. He thought of Silas through the old hermit, whose notes he'd once found carved into the rocks. "Every stone has a heart," Silas had written, "but only those who stay long enough can hear it beat." Back then, Ethan hadn't understood what it meant. Now, he did. He looked around at the cabins, the faint glow of lanterns inside, the rising columns of smoke. Each light was a heartbeat of someone starting over, of something being rebuilt. He smiled to himself, a sound halfway between a sigh and a prayer. "Maybe you were right, old man," he whispered. "Maybe this place does have a heart." Shadow padded up beside him, pressing against his leg. The dog's fur was warm, his eyes catching the moonlight. "Come on, boy," Ethan said softly. "Let's go home." The next morning, frost glittered over the valley one last time before melting for good. The stream ran stronger now, clear and bright, fed by the thawing snow. The men were already awake, hammering planks, mending tools, feeding the fire. Anna was painting the front of one of the cabins cheerful yellow against the gray mountain rock. When she saw Ethan, she waved the brush. "It needed a little color." He grinned. "Guess it did." She tilted her head. "You know, When I first met you, I thought you were running from something. Now it feels like you're building towards something." Ethan paused, then nodded. "Maybe both." She smiled, eyes kind. "That's the best kind of building there is." By sunset, the hollow was glowing. The cabins caught the golden light. The water shimmered like glass. Steam curled upward, mixing with wood smoke and laughter. Raymond strummed an old guitar someone had traded for supplies. The others hummed along, the melody rough but warm. Ethan sat back, watching the flames dance. He realized something simple, something quiet. He no longer felt like a visitor here. The war inside him, the one that had raged long after the battlefield had gone quiet too. The mountain, the spring, the fire, the people, they had all become part of something bigger than survival. They had become the heartbeat of Stone Hollow. When the song ended, silence fell, not empty, but full, the kind of silence that hums with peace. Ethan looked once more at the stream glowing under the moonlight. He placed a hand on the rough wood of the new sign, tracing the carved letters, "The Hollow of Warmth, a place to heal." The words no longer felt like a hope, they felt like a truth. And for the first time in years, Ethan Rowe allowed himself to simply stand still and listen. Somewhere deep beneath the stone, beneath the roots and the fire and the water, he swore he could hear it, faint but steady, the heartbeat of a place that he'd learned to love again. The heart of stone. By late February, the mountains looked alive again. The snow had thinned, but the air still carried that clean, sharp scent of winter. From miles away, travelers on the old road could see the faint column of steam rising from Stone Hollow, a white breath against the blue morning sky, as if the earth itself were breathing again. And people followed it, not because of signs or maps, but because of stories. Stories whispered in gas stations, shelters, and quiet corners of diners. "There's a place up north. Warm water, free food. Folks there don't ask who you were, just who you want to be." The first to arrive that week was a woman named Marla, who had been sleeping in her car since October. Then came two veterans from the coast, still carrying duffel bags stitched with names that weren't theirs anymore. And then, a boy, barely 20, who'd lost everything in a house fire. They came walking, hitching, limping, drawn not by comfort but by hope. Ethan saw them from the ridge above the hollow, their figures small against the white earth. He turned to Raymond, who was stacking wood by the fire pit. "Looks like we've got company again," he said with a quiet grin. Raymond smiled back. "This place is starting to feel like a station for lost souls." "Good," Ethan replied. "That means it's working." When the newcomers arrived, Ethan met them with open hands and a steaming pot of tea. He didn't ask questions, he didn't need to. He simply poured, handed them cups and said, "Welcome to the hollow. Rest while you can." The steam rose from the cups, mingling with the fog drifting off the hot spring. The scent of pine and wood smoke wrapped around them like a blanket. For the first time in a long time, no one needed to explain why they were there. That night, they all sat by the fire. The circle was bigger than before, 15 people, maybe more. Some were laughing quietly, others just watched the flames, eyes glazed with the kind of peace that takes years to find. Ethan told them the story of how it all began, how he'd once found the cabin for $10, broken and abandoned, how the spring beneath had glowed in the dark like a heartbeat, how a man named Silas Drew had left behind a note that said, "Keep this place kind," and that's what we did. Ethan said softly, "Every board, every nail, every fire built not to own, but to give." Raymond, sitting beside him, nodded slowly. "Maybe," he said, "you were the first one this spring healed." Ethan looked into the fire. The wood hissed and popped. He shook his head with a small smile. "No," he said quietly, "it was never me." He looked around at the faces lit by firelight, head shadow asleep with his head resting on Ethan's boot. "It was all of you. You made it warm." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the steady, gentle pulse of the spring behind them, that ancient rhythm beneath the mountain. Days passed, and the hollow grew livelier. Someone built a bench near the water. Someone else painted an old fence blue. The air was filled with hammering laughter and music from Raymond's battered guitar. Anna stopped by every few days, bringing bread and stories from the town. She'd stand by the path watching the steam curl upward, smiling like she was seeing a miracle happen in slow motion. One morning, as she packed up to leave, she turned to Ethan and said, "You know, you didn't just rebuild this place. You rebuild people." He chuckled. "Guess I just gave them tools." She smiled back. "Sometimes that's all anyone needs." As February faded, so did the snow. Grass began to peek through the melted patches, soft and trembling. The creek ran faster now, its song louder, and from above, the hollow looked like a living heart, cabins like chambers, paths like veins. and that shining spring at its center. Ethan stood at the ridge again one evening, Shadow at his side. Below, the campfires flickered dots of gold in the blue dusk. He closed his eyes and listened, to laughter, to footsteps, to the faint hum of the earth. It sounded like peace. The next morning was warm enough that steam hung low over the valley, glowing in the sunrise. It rolled through the trees, over the roofs, down the riverbank, soft, white, endless. From a distance, it looked like the breath of the world, a place not forgotten, but forgiven. Raymond joined Ethan by the water, holding 2 cups of tea. He handed one over, then said with a smile, "You ever think Silas Drew might be watching all this?" Ethan looked toward the rising mist. "I think he's part of it." Raymond nodded slowly. "Guess that makes you the keeper now." Ethan chuckled under his breath. "Nah, I'm just another man trying to stay warm." They stood there for a long while, sipping in silence, steam wrapping around them. As the sun climbed higher, the mist began to fade, breaking apart into thin threads of light. The world shimmered as if even the air itself wanted to begin again. Ethan knelt by the spring, placed his hand in the water one last time. It was warm just like the first day he'd found it. But now, it wasn't just warmth from the earth. It was warmth made by people, by their hands, their work, their kindness. He whispered, half to himself, "Grace doesn't come as miracles. It begins with cold hands choosing to build a home again." Shadow pressed close beside him, eyes soft. Ethan smiled and scratched his fur. "Come on, boy," he murmured. "Let's go meet whoever's next." They turned toward the path, where the smoke from a new fire was rising, a sign that someone else had arrived. And as the light broke fully over the valley, the last breath of mist lifted into the sky, the warmth of Stone Hollow spreading, quiet and eternal.